Tess, for those who didn't know me, so I've been studying here. I was doing a PhD here, and as Elliot said, I'm lucky enough to do a postdoc now with Brian in Montreal. So Brian Mishara is the director of the Center for Research and Intervention on Suicide, Ethical Issues and End-of-Life Practices that we call CRISE, which is an acronym, and a professor of psychology at the University du Québec à Montréal in Montreal, Canada. His publication includes 7 books in English and 5 in French. He conducts research on new technologies in suicide prevention, the effectiveness of suicide prevention programs, how children understand suicide, theories of suicidality, ethical issues, euthanasia and assisted suicide, and evaluation of helpline effectiveness. He was a founder of Suicide Action Montreal, the Montreal Suicide Prevention Center. He's a past president of the International Association for Suicide Prevention and of the Canadian Association for Suicide Prevention, and a vice chairperson of the trustees of Befrienders Worldwide. He also consults and conducts suicide prevention training internationally. And finally, he has served on the Canadian Federal Committee charged with making recommendations on possibly expanding the criteria for access to medical aid in dying, euthanasia, and assisted suicide in Canada. And that's the short bio. So thank you, Brian, for being with us. And
okay, thank you very much, Tess. So I'm going to talk a little bit about medical assistance in dying and its relationship to suicide prevention, and whether or not there are some deaths we should not prevent or even encourage. And I'm going to try to do this in the context of a country which is considering legalizing medical assistance in dying, or some forms of medical assistance in dying. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a lot of things, and we can hopefully have some time for questions. We all have an image of what constitutes a good death. We also have our fears of what our death might be like, and we have visual images of this. We have concerns. There's something about death which we find we want to avoid, and I always think of Bob Kastenbaum's early 1970s video studies, where he had an actor, play the role of a patient who had some vague stomach pains, and they recruited volunteers to come in and spend some time visiting patients in the hospital. And half the volunteers, they told that the patient was dying from some sort of terminal cancer. And the other half, they said the person had an ulcer. And when you look at the videos within the first seconds, you can tell what the patient was told. Because when they thought the person was dying, they would keep their distance. They stayed a full meter further away from the person. And in addition to that, they often didn't touch the person. When they thought it was just an ulcer, they came close, they hugged them or shook their hand, gave them a kiss on the cheek, but when they were dying, they kept their distance, or they did it very briefly, a little peck on the cheek or a distance handshake. Well, this being days when we didn't have ethics committees that were very strict, after a while, they said to everyone, you know, the person who was dying, they misdiagnosed him. He's fine. He's going to leave the hospital. It's nothing. And the other person, was always the same actor, but the group of people who thought that the person had just some ulcer, they said, well, you know, we've discovered he's got stage 4 cancer. He doesn't have long to live. And immediately, you look at the beginning of the videos, the people come closer, they touch the person who's dying, the one who's, now has cancer they thought was all right. They still shake their hands, but they keep their body a full foot further away. and they still give them a little hug, but the hug's quicker and colder. So, we have this something about death that we're fearful of, and those fears pertain to our own death as well as our view of deaths of others. So we all have our fantasies and concerns and thoughts. And one of the questions is, how do we deal with those concerns and thoughts? And we try to fend off against all odds, this inevitability of death. And a lot of ways we deal with it, our preoccupation with heroes who, against all odds, are able to continue to live and conquer death. That preoccupation may be one way of dealing with our fears about death and dying. So we got to get back to our question. Are there some circumstances where we want to not prevent a death or encourage death? And we live in a post-Kantian world of secular humanism, and rather than having absolutes, principles, which we could say, this is what we stand for, everything seems to be blurred into some form of relativism. There's exceptions. There is even philosophers who use the term quasi-absolutes, which seems tautological to me. And in this context, we all have an idea of what constitutes a good death. And this varies quite a bit. For some people, it's dying in their sleep and not being aware they're dying. For others, it's saying a long goodbye, surrounded by loving family and friends. For others, it's dying with their boots on, continuing to work and just dying suddenly. And we also have ideas about how others should die in a more appropriate way. But nowadays, death is not as present as it used to be. People used to die at home mostly. Now most people die in hospital. There are specialists who are concerned with dealing with the people who are dying. And also, suffering, pain of any type, is something which in contemporary society, something we should avoid at all costs. And it is politically incorrect to consider that anyone should be suffering in their life, a woman in childbirth, or we want to minimize all suffering, which is one of the values of contemporary society. But when it comes to death, which is something we aren't going to be able to control, we're all going to die, one of the major concerns is this loss of control, the idea that somehow we're not going to be able to control what's happening. Others, Mr. or Miss or Mrs. Death, will be controlling us. This in New Zealand society, I assume as much as in Canada, the idea to make choices in life is paramount. We live in a society where we want to be able to eat what we want, and live where we want, and marry with whom we want, and have whatever career we want. There's a certain self-actualization which involves being able to choose. And the obvious extension of that is, why not choose how we're going to die? So, and it's a way of getting some control over death. Now, often we think we know what we want, but we've never died. We've never gone through that process. And so it's difficult to know exactly what we want in the future. And some years ago, I did a research project where we followed up people who had AIDS, and this is before the more effective medications to control AIDS were available. And we asked people about their plans and what their desires are. And later on, we asked people, is there someone we can contact if we can't reach you? And we reached a close relative and asked them what happened when they died. And we videotaped this, and I could show you a videotape of a person who said, look, when I'm no longer available to do the things that I really enjoy doing in life, that's it. I have an agreement with a friend. We got some medication. I'm just going to take it. I don't want to be a burden to anyone. I don't want to go through any undignified situations. And show you another tape of a man saying, look, I am practicing Catholic. I believe it's up to God to take me when the time comes, and like Job, whatever is thrown at me, I'm going to have to put up with it. And then we looked at how people actually died and what they wanted at that time, and we found almost a zero relationship between what people thought they would want and what they actually did. In this instance, that man who said, look, I don't want to be a burden. When I can't enjoy life, I want to go. He wound up bedridden, in a lot of pains, blind, and every day his friend said, is today the day you want to die? And he did everything to live another day, another hour, and was refused any idea of dying earlier. And that same man who said it's up to God was begging his doctor to end his life when he was in a very difficult and painful situation. So I think it's easy to say that's what I want, but we're not really very good at it. Now, there's a lot of research on why people want to die by euthanasia, assisted suicide. Spent hours summarizing it. But basically, if people have cancer and they're in pain, very often they want to end their life. But when you control the pain, that desire goes away. And people with physical handicaps, people who've lost legs and so forth, if obviously after the immediate trauma, if this occurs, it's not congenital, but it occurs at a certain moment, there's a period of difficulties, higher suicide risk. But overall, people with whatever form of handicap you study have a lower suicide rate than people who aren't handicapped, and less desire to end their life, particularly by euthanasia or assisted suicide. The other concern is that a lot of the treatments that we use to sustain life have as a side effect depression, clinical depression, often very profound depression. Many of the medications used to stop or slow the progress of cancers and so forth. So we have these iatrogenic depressions, which are caused by treatments. They're a side effect of treatments, which could profit from treatments for the depression as well. There are a few exceptions. There are some high-risk groups which are just there. For example, people who need hemodialysis on a regular basis, they're at high risk of suicide. They often want to die, but in general, it's not necessarily the case. If you look in the state of Oregon, for example, and obviously these are not mutually exclusive reasons, but you ask people, why did you ask for assisted suicide? Oregon was the first U.S. state to legalize assisted suicide, and on the top of the list, and it's increasing in number, is being less able to engage in activities making life enjoyable, followed by loss of autonomy and loss of dignity. You notice that pain is really down lower on the list, even though that's the image people say, I don't want to suffer physically. Usually it's not so much the physical suffering, but something to do with not wanting to live the life I'm living, but wanting a better life or a different life than the one that is going on. And the problem of not being able to well predict what we're going to like or want in the future has some implications if the legislation that's going to be proposed allows for advance directive. Advance directives say, I don't want to die now, but I have a degenerative disease, and when I'm at a certain state, I may not be competent to decide, but I want to end it. And I think that the problems with advance directives, and in some instances, it just seems so obvious that this diminishes suffering or needless prolongation of life. And most advance directives are used in cases of degenerative brain diseases like Alzheimer's. But it's not so simple. And there's a recent case in Belgium where a person had the beginning symptoms of Alzheimer's, and he signed an advance directive form. He was legally competent to do so. And later on, it was a few years later, he was completely confused. He didn't recognize anyone in his family. He didn't know what day it was. He was confused about how old he was. He was just out of it. And that's, according to the advance directive, he said, if I ever get to that state, I don't want to go on living. And the doctor came in the room, and he said, who are you? And Dr. So-and-so, he signed an advance directive, this and that. The guy said, you come here to kill me. I don't want to die. And he said, well, you're actually not legally competent to change that directive right now. And the guy said, don't kill me. I don't want to die. And he said, well, you signed this. And basically, two staff members held him down while the doctor gave him a lethal injection. This is still in the courts. We'll see what happens with that. But technically, it responds to all the legal criteria. So what do we do in a situation we haven't yet experienced and we don't know what it's going to be like? We often want to keep all the options open. And for this reason, the idea that we have some form of medical assistance in dying is something that is very popular, and it's usually fairly easy to pass when people start talking about it and publicizing the horrendous situations that some people can be in, which everyone is fearful might be them, whether there's any empirical evidence that will be the case or not. I think I should say something about, here in Canada, we legalize medical assistance in dying. I've published several papers on some of these topics, but what is it? It's what's called euthanasia, where a doctor ends your life, and assisted suicide, where a doctor provides or someone provides the means for killing yourself. So in the US, only assisted suicide has been legalized in several states. And basically the doctor gives you a prescription, you go to the chemist, pharmacy, you fill the prescription, and you can take this medicine to end your own life. Since you take it, it's a suicide, so the assistance is providing the prescription, which is different from a doctor actively ending your life, which up until a few years ago in Canada was a homicide. and now it's not under the law providing for medical assistance in suicide. Now, Professor David Weisstubb, who is an ethicist and legal scholar, and I have written a number of articles on the ethical issues in suicide prevention and suicide research, and the internet and other things. And basically, we describe different moral stances that one can take, or ethical premises that we can use to decide how far we'll go or what we'll do in suicide prevention. And on the one hand, there are people we can call moralists who believe that life needs to be preserved. This is a principle. To the extent possible, we should always preserve life. You can believe this because you have some religious belief, but it's not necessary. You could also believe in some categorical imperative that, in order to have a just society, it is essential that we protect life under all, instances. If you have that approach, you'll do everything to protect someone's life. And if someone is terminally ill and wants to die, you're still going to do the same suicide prevention intervention because you want to try to protect life as best you can. The other extreme, you can have a libertarian view. The existential philosophers had such a position where some said that the ultimate choice that we can make in life is to live or die, that suicide is an option and it's a right and it is an essential part of being human. And the psychiatrist Thomas Szasz often tried to convince people that one should not do anything in suicide prevention, that suicide prevention was just a rational, logical decision that people can make, a choice that people could make, and it must always be respected. Most of us are not moralists or libertarians. We fall somewhere in between. We're relativists, and a relativist believes that what you will do to prevent a death depends on something. And it could depend on the context or the situation. The person's terminally ill, they're going to die anyway, maybe I shouldn't do any suicide prevention. Or the consequences. And we believe that these often implicit ethical beliefs or premises they determine practice. And one of the case examples we've written about is a comparison of the intervention policies of the U.S. National Network of Suicide Prevention Helplines and the United Kingdom network, which is the Samaritans, and how they react when someone is in the process of a suicide attempt. In the U.S., which is more extreme than in Canada, but basically if a person has started a suicide attempt, someone calls the center and says, I just took so many of these pills, and you know that this is lethal or dangerous, they will say, look, we need an ambulance, where do you live? And if the person refuses to give that information, they will trace a call and send an ambulance, often with the police who might break down the door. Because the U.S. Is the only country in the world where the most common method of suicide is firearms, the police officer takes out his gun when he breaks down the door. So every week or two, there's someone killed by a policeman who comes to save their life because they're suicidal, because he sort of sees the person and says, but down that gun, they hesitate or whatever. But anyway, they justify this practice by a moral belief that we have an obligation to save lives. They also have some consequentialist arguments. They say that very often even people say, don't send an ambulance, don't save me, I just want to die. Call back and say, thank you for saving my life. In the UK, they believe that the decision to live or die rests with each individual caller or texter. A lot of services are now by text and chat. And they will do everything possible to convince the person to accept help. But ultimately, the decision rests with the caller. So if someone has taken an overdose, they will say, look, you need an ambulance, I'm going to send one, where do you live? And if the person says no, they will stay with that person and do everything possible to convince them to accept help. And they usually succeed. But if they don't, it's the person's decision. They justify this by this fundamental belief in the autonomous decision-making of their callers, but they also use some consequentialist arguments saying that if we start breaking our promise of anonymity and confidentiality and we trace calls, people who are in need of our services will hesitate to call. They won't call. We won't be able to save their lives because they're afraid of this practice. Now, often there is a disconnect between what the practices should be on paper and what people actually do. And we've published papers where we were evaluating suicide prevention activities in centers across the U.S. We listened to 2,611 calls, and in 4 of those calls, someone actually said to a caller, go ahead and kill yourself, which is against all the rules. They were extreme situations. A man was standing on a bridge, said, I've tried everything to stop raping my daughter, who's 8 years old, and he went through all that, and he said, the only thing I can do is kill myself. I don't want to continue doing this. And the guy said, go ahead and jump. Okay. Whenever MAID has been legalized, it has expanded. It's being legalized more and more and more and more countries, but also it's being expanded to include more and more groups of people. Nowhere did it say it was just for these people and these are the only criteria. No one else has access. Everywhere the access increases over time. And this is MAID. By MAID, I mean medical assistance in dying, which includes euthanasia and assisted suicide. Those two practices. The Netherlands has gone the farthest, at least in what they proposed. There was a parliamentary proposal for that anyone who's over age 65 could request to have their life ended, even if they're in perfect health, just because they are tired of living. And after this proposal came before Parliament, the government changed. You have a much more conservative government. So it's not going to pass unless the government changes, but that's the extreme situation. In Canada, medical assistance in dying, or MAID, was approved first in Quebec, which is why they called it medical assistance in dying rather than euthanasia and assisted suicide. Sounds much more acceptable to have a doctor help you when you're dying, to have a doctor end your life or euthanize you like you do to dogs and cats. So the same practice, but the words make it much more acceptable. And a lot of people don't understand exactly what they mean. There's some research on that. But it was restricted to people for whom death was in this foreseeable future. They didn't define what that means, but still, it was for people who are going to die soon. And this past September, the Quebec Superior Court said that this was discriminatory against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms of Canada, and so that is no longer a criteria. So basically, anyone who meets the other criteria, which is basically that the person is legally competent, and everyone is legally competent unless a judge says they're not. So it's very rare that someone's not, and that this is thought out, and that the person is suffering, feels that they are suffering. And they convince two doctors that they meet these criteria. They have access. So right now, until Parliament adopts some regulations to say who may not have access, we have a situation where anyone who's suffering from anything under the sun can technically request to have their life ended. And that's basically the only criteria. They have to have some illness or problem, but mental health problems were not excluded. Trudeau has just designated a person to head a committee or a group that will make some recommendations about that legislation. We can talk a little bit about that in the future. Well, is there a difference between maiden suicide? The most detailed explanation of the differences is in a document from the American Association of Suicidology, which lists a number of differences as in euthanasia or assisted suicide or MAID. This happens in suicide, it's different. And if you look at that list, almost all of the characteristics are characteristics of the practice. So they say usually when you died by MAID, you can be surrounded by your family and friends, but suicides generally occur when you're alone. There are a lot of that. Often the method used for dying can be more painful in the case of a suicide. But these are technical aspects of how you do it. It doesn't get at the root question. Is there a difference in the experience or the psychology or the motivations of the people who want to die by suicide and people who want to die by medical assistance in dying, or people who are physically ill or terminally ill versus people who are not? And that is one of the main questions. And one of the things that they suggested is that it's more rational to want to die when you're terminally ill or you have a degenerative disease than people who are suicidal, who have mental health problems. They're irrational, and they're in an irrational state because of alcohol or being in a panic or a very difficult situation. I believe that when people use the word rational to describe someone who wants medical assistance in dying, they really mean that this is understandable. People are saying, if I was in that situation, I'd want to do that. It doesn't mean that there's some rational process going on in the decision making. And there's, in this case of suicide, your ability to reason is compromised by the presence often of a mental disorder. I'm depressed, everything seems dark regardless. Or someone who has a psychosis and is hallucinating or deluded. And also in a crisis situation, we panic, we don't think very rationally. In the case of MAID, though, usually the criteria is that you have physical suffering, and when you are suffering physically and mentally as well, there's research showing that you're not good at any sorts of decision-making tasks. You know, when you're experiencing pain, you don't suddenly get super rational logically, you just irrational. You want it to end. And there's research supporting that. Furthermore, and I really think this is important, I don't believe that important human decisions are rational. You know, what's the most important decision you ever made in your life? With whom you marry? You know, did you weigh all the good characteristics and positive traits of the person against all their possible negative characteristics or defects and make a rational decision? He or she, they would be a good choice. No. It's an emotional decision. Even when we buy a car, we don't buy the most reliable, economical, friendly to the environment. What are we buying? We're buying big SUVs, which we like the looks of and so forth. So in general, important life decisions are not rational, they're emotional. And to think that when someone's suffering and dying, they're suddenly going to make their decisions rationally, when the research shows they're likely to be less rational, is absurd. The other thing that is often mentioned without being backed up by data is that the decision to end your life by MAID is less ambivalent in the case where you have a physical illness, you're dying anyway, or you have some debilitating disease that's getting worse and worse. And people don't change their minds. Where in suicide, there's a lot of ambivalence, which has been demonstrated. In Oregon, very few people apply for assisted suicide. 1,600, 700 out of, in a year, 35,000 people die. So it's a fairly small percentage of people who die who apply for assisted suicide. They convince two doctors they can't go on living. They're suffering too much. The doctors give them a prescription so they can end their life. Well, 36% of them fill the prescription. They put it on the shelf or in a drawer in their pocket, and they never use it. They keep it as insurance just in case it gets really bad. And this leads to another concern that I have, and that is that there are two types of practice that are legalized. In the US, it's just assisted suicide. In Canada, it's assisted suicide and euthanasia. They're both called medical assistance to die for political, practical reasons. It makes it a lot easier to get these things adopted and accepted. But in Canada, it's only really euthanasia that's practiced. And the difference is that in the case of euthanasia, you make an appointment, the doctor comes, he asks you, you sure you want to go ahead with this? But your friends and relatives are here, you've said your goodbyes, the moment has come. It's not so easy to say, maybe I'd like to live another day. Could you come back tomorrow, everyone? Or if the doctor comes back the next day, says, maybe a few more days. It's very difficult to express that ambivalence with an important person and everything's planned. So it's very rare that people postpone their death. In the case of euthanasia, by an assisted suicide, not only do more than 1/3, 36%, not die from assisted suicide, but many more don't die immediately and put off until they're ready and they can put it off as much as they want because they have the autonomy. So in the case of assisted suicide, you have more autonomy to decide the timing of your death. Now, we live in a society where we believe in autonomy. We choose to smoke, no matter what they say about how dangerous it is. We can marry whoever we like, even against the wishes of everyone else and everyone else's opinion. We can refuse medical care. We want to choose everything in life, where we live, what we do for work. But at the same time, society does step in for our own good to protect us against ourselves and protect vulnerable people. So almost everywhere you can't drive without wearing a seatbelt or have a fine. I can't ride my motorcycle without wearing a helmet. I can't walk into a shop and buy some heroin legally. Society does do things to protect people from making poor decisions and protect vulnerable populations. So the challenge for anyone who is concerned with legalizing medical assistance in dying is how to balance that strong desire for autonomy. I want to decide, and I don't want anyone to tell me anything or limit my ability to choose what I want, even when and how I die, versus protecting me from making a poor decision. And that's where the laws and how the laws are written comes in. The other point I want to make is about hopelessness. Hopelessness is often confused. The fact that there's a prognosis as hopeless is confused with feeling hopeless. People can have a hopeless prognosis and not feel hopeless at all. There are ways to build hope, which people in suicide prevention learn, and there's no empirical data showing that there's more hopelessness in people who request MAID than people who are suicidal. And there's a lot of support for the fact that we can increase hope. I was going to say briefly a little bit about Pandora in the jar. It really was a jar up until the 16th century when they decided to make it a box. And basically Pandora was given this jar and she went to Earth. Zeus gave it to her and she was supposed to marry, and her husband, Zeus said, whatever you do, don't open the jar. And she was very curious, and she opened the jar, and up until that time, there was no death and suffering and disease and violence, no old age even on Earth. And all those things came out to be part of human life forever. But unknown to Zeus, Prometheus added something to the jar. He added hope. And so hope also came out of the jar in order to help us live through all those horrendous things which were unleashed upon us by Pandora's curiosity. So I don't believe that respect for autonomy precludes active interventions. I can do my best to get someone to have more hope and be in less despair, and ultimately the decision rests with them. And I believe that we have an obligation to alleviate suffering before providing access to death as a means of alleviating suffering. In the Netherlands, which is the country where there's the most practice proportionally of euthanasia, mostly in assisted suicide, in the world, the first to legalize euthanasia, and the most liberal in terms of criteria for access until recently. Physicians refuse, depending on the study, about 45 to 50% of all requests. And one of the main reasons for refusing requests is that they have a criteria that if the doctor believes there is some other way of alleviating the person's pain and suffering other than ending their life, and the person hasn't tried this, the person has to try this before having access to death provided by the society to end their pain and suffering. And people who have this type of refusal rarely come back and request euthanasia or assisted suicide in the Netherlands. The person doesn't have to do this, but if they don't, the society doesn't have to furnish death as a way of ending their suffering. In Canada, when they wrote the law, this was not how it was written. The law in Canada states that the doctor must inform the patient of any available means for diminishing suffering, but it is up to the patient to determine if she or he feel that that is acceptable. So the doctor can say, look, what you're going through can be treated simply. You're depressed as a side effect of that medication, or you need some more social support. We're going to do that. And the person just has to say, no, I don't find that acceptable. I want to die. And the doctor is obliged to provide aid. There's no way out because you cannot refuse it because it's a treatment. And this becomes very important when you consider someone who has a mental illness as the sole reason for wanting to die, who is someone who's stopped taking their meds. They say, take your meds and we'll see if you still want to die. The person says, no, I don't like my meds. Just kill me. And according to current Canadian law, until hopefully there'll be some legislation that will give some controls. Right now, after the Superior Court decision, which is not being contested by the government, not appealed to the Supreme Court, right now there's no real controls on this. So David Weistub and I have written up some of this. We have references. You can read it. So I'm going to end now with some recommendations for a country considering legalizing some form of medical assistance in dying. I think you need to identify vulnerable populations that need protection and figure out how you're going to protect them. That might be minors, children, or persons with a mental disorder, or persons in a very compromised situation. I think you should consider assisted suicide over euthanasia, since it better protects autonomy to decide to wait before dying and not proceed because of social pressures. You have to assume that any limit in your initial legislation will be challenged. And if you look at all the countries that have had some limit just to people who are terminally ill with just these illnesses and just physical and not mental, in almost all instances over time, the door opens wider and wider. So what you have to do is make sure that the law you write, even you think you don't have to be concerned with someone with a mental illness, but you've excluded them. If you do exclude them, you want to make sure that if they were later included, that there are sufficient controls to protect vulnerable people in those circumstances. I believe it's important to adopt a guiding principle that death should never be a substitute for treatment and interventions that can alleviate the anguish. When the Canadian Parliament was debating this, it was proposed that there'd be an obligation for the doctor to, if there were treatments available that could alleviate the suffering, to provide those treatments before having access to MAID. And some of the discussion around this said, well, if we put that in, that means that the government's going to have to be liable for making sure everyone has access to good palliative care and hospices, and that could be a problem. We can't do that. So they took it out. I think this is an important principle. The devil is in the details. Surveillance procedures. You know, in the Netherlands, again, they have reporting. They have a group that investigates all the contentious cases, and all the transcripts of their investigations are public. In Canada, they have committees which keep everything anonymous and secret and come up with a report, but no access to any of the data. You don't know what that report is based upon. How do you know the rules are respected and what are your procedures is very important. When a psychological or psychiatric evaluation is necessary, not necessary or obligatory in any circumstance in Canada, and some for other countries not, and some it is. If you legalize advanced directives, be very specific about what circumstances, and the issue of dementia is a really difficult one. Some people with advanced dementia suffer. Some people with advanced dementia don't suffer. It's quite something to go ahead and end someone's life who may not be able to assent to this at the time. If made for someone whose only trouble is that they suffer from a mental illness is allowed, you have to be very specific on what controls are needed. Consider if after you pass your law, death clinics can come up where people can go for MAID when their personal physician refuses it. This exists in the Netherlands. There are clinics that basically, it's all they do is end people's life, and people who go there very often have seen their personal physician who's known them for many years, and the physician says, no, you don't meet the criteria. But somehow when they go to the clinic, they do meet the criteria. So that might come up. You should anticipate that. Suicide prevention services should not use any form of illness, disability, or whether or not someone's eligible for MAID or age or terminal diagnosis as a justification to discriminate. I believe that we should help anyone, and if they don't profit from the help or decide they want to end their life by MAID and they're eligible, that's their choice, but I will still do everything possible to prevent their death. This was one of the concluding paragraphs in the article to deprive people who meet the criteria for MAID of the opportunity to receive suicide prevention interventions by putting them in a category apart has no empirical or clinically reliable justification. Providing help to all without discrimination is not incompatible with respect for autonomous decision-making. Offering suicide prevention interventions to all provides an opportunity for some people who otherwise would have died prematurely to regain the will to live, regardless of their circumstances. Thank you. We'll have a little time for some questions.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for your excellent presentation. I wonder if you can comment at all, please, in those areas where MAID has occurred, whether there is around the evidence of its impact on unintended suicides or any change or effect on the overall suicide rates in the population.
There is no evidence that I have seen that legalization of MAID impacts suicide rates. There's no, they don't decrease, they don't increase. Some people have given the argument that when you legalize MAID, that will avoid horrendous deaths using violent means by suicide, where people who want to die will now have another option. There's no evidence for that, but there's also no evidence that suicides increase, that the idea of liberalizing the idea of it's okay to die in certain circumstances makes it more in people liberal in general and will increase suicides. Basically, suicide rates seem to be driven by other factors, but more research can come on that.
Mark Huswaiter, Mr. Carterton, Wellington. Where MAID is legalized, how does that affect aspects of mental health acts and compulsory admissions for people who are suicidal?
It really causes a lot of interesting situations. For example, there are often cases where the mental health acts stay, usually, and the person is hospitalized for a suicide attempt. They're treated for the physical problems, and then they say, well, now I want medical assistance in dying because I suffer from depression. The psychiatrists haven't been able to help me. Medications don't work. I tried therapy. I have years of it. I want access to MAID. And it depends on the jurisdictions. We think of the Netherlands as being very liberal, and they get literally thousands of requests each year from people who have a mental disorder as the sole reason, and they for MAID. And their criteria, there has to be no other treatment available. So they really have to have tried everything to have access. And of the thousands of requests, and I don't have the number on the tip of my tongue, about 50 are granted each year. A very, very small portion, because they have a whole criteria of, psychiatric examination, so forth. They just revised the criteria for access this year. Earlier this year, there's guidelines from the Psychiatric Association for people, how to deal with people who request MAID. But it certainly is in contradiction to the idea of hospitalizing someone, against their will, who is a danger to themselves. The issue is, if this is something you are going to do, and usually, I don't know of any jurisdiction that has immediately legalized access to MAID for people with psychiatric disorders, but this could happen. Usually, it's down the road. It's a year later, someone goes to court and say, I'm suffering as much as that person with cancer. I have every right to have access. It's discriminatory just because my illness is a mental illness, it's not a physical illness. And most courts, because you know, the danger is having legislation made by courts rather than legislators. If you have some sort of charter of rights and freedom, they can look at it and might say this is discriminatory. Who's to say that that person isn't suffering more or less, and so forth, of why the criteria of death and so forth. So, and this comes in how you draft the legislation, what the objectives of the legislation are. If it is drafted in such a way that the goal is to help people eliminate intolerable suffering, period, without any indications of the need to make sure that there's no treatment for the suffering, or defining intolerable suffering in such a way that whatever someone thinks is intolerable suffering, these are all little details which aren't so little there. They have tremendous implications for how things play out in real life. But yeah, it's certainly problematic.
Is there any research about the impact on family where a MAID has occurred?
Well, actually, I'm one of the co-authors of a paper that just came out on that very topic, which was a systematic review of the research. And I disagree a little bit with the tone of the conclusions of the other co-authors, but you know, it's acceptable basically because I think there's not enough research and there is some sampling issues on who responds to this. But if you look at the existing research to date, it indicates that the bereavement process and grief following a death by MAID is easier than certainly bereavement following a suicide, and is not any. If anything, it's easier than even a natural death, particularly when that natural death is not easily predictable. That being said, these are not sampling where you look at everyone. You look at those who accept to participate in the study, and that's something that needs to be examined more. But there's no evidence that it causes any particular problems for family. There are a number of cases, though, where families have been going to court because usually the legislation doesn't give any role to families. I mean, some say families need to be informed, and others totally ignore families. In Canada, the only person who has a right to make the decision is the person who makes the request. No one else has to be informed. And there's a case right now where a person who had psychiatric problems died by MAID, and he said, "I don't tell the family," and they were astonished that this occurred. He also had some physical problems. The family contends that the physical problems were all treatable, and that was all happening because he stopped taking his medications. So, you know, there are a lot of instances where there's a case in Belgium now where a person died by MAID and told the psychiatrist that the reason I want to die is my family doesn't care about me. They never visit. They've abandoned me. And I have no reason to go on living. And I have this history of psychiatric problems. And the family had no idea that the person had requested MAID. And the family thought the person didn't want them to visit and said if we had any inkling that the person wanted us around, we would have been there and that person wouldn't have died. Why didn't someone tell us? And this is in the courts in Belgium now. But overall, there's no evidence that there's anything negative, any negative impact on family and friends.
Looks like we've wound up then. So thank you, Brian. That was fascinating, and again, really grateful that you've provided this for the Department of Psychological Medicine at the University of Otago here in Wellington. Any last comments from you, Tess?
No, I'm just seeing that Luke has been posting stuff on the group chat. Is it like references? There's a link there.
Oui, c'est l'article de recension sur l'endeuillement suicidaire.
Yeah, Luke posted the article, the literature review on the impact of a death by medical assistance in dying on family. He just posted that reference.
Nice, brilliant. And I can see that people are chatting and from remote locations and thanking you for the talk today. Yep, so that's good.
Great, and I'd be curious sometime when you get back to find out what's happening in New Zealand and what sort of legislation is being prepared, because my concern, which I think has been realized in Canada, is that if it's not carefully thought out, a lot of people could die prematurely who could have continued to live, and the details matter in drafting legislation such as this.